In 1997, a cable network aired a cartoon about 4 children in a small Colorado town, and over the next 3 decades, that cartoon would threaten governments, provoke death threats, get banned in entire nations, humiliate celebrities, enrage religious organizations, lose its own cast members, and somehow never get canceled. That is the plainest version of the story. But the fuller version is stranger, because it is not really a story about a television show at all. It is a story about what happens when 2 people decide they are not afraid of anything, and then spend nearly 30 years proving it, episode after episode, scandal after scandal, until the scandals themselves become a kind of history. A history of the lines that exist in public life, and what happens when someone walks across every single one of them. Not once, not occasionally, but as a matter of principle. South Park did not stumble into controversy. It walked in on purpose, looked around, and never left. And the result is one of the most remarkable and unbroken records of provocation in the history of American media. Not provocation for its own sake, though there is plenty of that, but provocation as a method, as a philosophy, as a way of testing the world to see what it will tolerate and what it will not, and then using the results as material. This is Paper Town. Find a comfortable position. Let the room go quiet. This one covers a lot of ground, and there is no rush at all. The place to begin is not with the controversies themselves, but with the moment the show arrived, because the arrival was itself a kind of scandal. A disruption so complete that it remade the network that broadcast it. On August 13th, 1997, Comedy Central aired the first episode of South Park, titled The Pilot Episode, at 10 in the evening. The title alone was a provocation. Here was a show about 8-year-old boys, animated in a crude cutout style that looked almost deliberately cheap, as if the aesthetic itself were a rejection of everything polished and respectable. And in its very first episode, it featured alien abduction, rear probing, flatulence, the repeated use of the word dildo in both its literal and pejorative senses, and a level of profanity that had not been heard on basic cable before. The critical response was immediate and almost unanimously hostile. Tom Shales of the Washington Post described the show as self-congratulatory in its vulgarity and noted a general air of malicious unpleasantness. The Hollywood Reporter dismissed it as a witless offering that wanted to score by being aggressively offensive, but managed only to be dumb. These were not minor outlets. These were the institutions that determined whether a show was taken seriously, and they had rendered their verdict. South Park was trash, and yet the audience did not agree. The ratings were enormous, far beyond anything Comedy Central had experienced. The network, which at the time was a minor cable channel struggling for identity, broadcasting reruns of old sitcoms and low-budget original programming, suddenly had a cultural phenomenon on its hands. Within months, South Park merchandise was everywhere. The characters appeared on t-shirts, lunchboxes, bumper stickers. The catchphrases entered the language, and the creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, 2 friends from Colorado, who had been making crude animated shorts since their time at the University of Colorado, suddenly had a platform with an audience of millions. What they chose to do with that platform, the targets they selected, the lines they crossed, and the consequences they absorbed would define not just the show, but in many ways, the limits of what American television was willing to broadcast. But even before the show reached television, it had already generated its first scandal, one that reveals much about the entertainment industry's relationship with offensive material. Before Comedy Central picked up South Park, Parker and Stone had shopped the concept to Fox. The network passed. The reason, according to multiple accounts, was a single character. Mr. Hanky, the Christmas Pooh, a sentient, singing piece of human excrement who appears to Kyle during the holiday season, was too much for Fox's standards department. The network that would later air Family Guy and The Simpsons, both of which would push their own boundaries considerably, could not get past the idea of an animated turd. Fox refused to pick up the show. Comedy Central, with less to lose and less to protect, said yes. The decision was transformative for the network. South Park turned Comedy Central from an afterthought into a destination, and it did so by being exactly the thing that a larger, more cautious network had been too afraid to air. There is a lesson in that sequence of events, and it is a lesson that South Park would teach the entertainment industry repeatedly over the following decades. The thing that everybody is afraid of is often the thing that everybody wants to watch. The early controversies seem almost quaint now, but they were real enough at the time, and they established the pattern that would govern the show's relationship with the public for years to come. The Parents Television Council, founded by conservative activist L. Brent Bozell III, identified South Park as a primary target almost from its first season. Bozell called the show sordid and filth, and said it should never have been made. He did not limit himself to statements. The PTC organized sustained campaigns against South Park, urging its members to contact the Federal Communications Commission with indecency complaints, pressuring advertisers to pull their sponsorships, and lobbying Comedy Central to cancel the show outright. The PTC was not a fringe organization. At its peak, it commanded a membership large enough to flood the FCC with thousands of complaints about a single episode. And in 2004, the FCC itself reported that the PTC was the primary source of most content complaints the commission received. The organization's influence was real, and for a time, it represented a genuine threat to the show's continued existence. But the threat never materialized into action. The show continued. The ratings held. The advertisers, by and large, stayed. And Parker and Stone, rather than retreating in the face of organized opposition, seemed to take the criticism as validation, as proof that they were doing something that mattered enough to provoke a response. Each new season pushed further than the last, and the PTC became less a credible threat than a kind of weather vane. If Bozel was angry, the show was doing its job. If the PTC was filing complaints, the episode had landed where it was meant to land. The dynamic between South Park and the PTC is worth understanding because it recurs in different forms throughout the show's history. An external organization identifies an episode as harmful. It mobilizes its resources. It demands action, and the show absorbs the attack, uses it as material, and continues. The PTC was the first to discover what the Church of Scientology, the Catholic League, the Chinese Communist Party, and various Islamic organizations would all learn in turn. Attacking South Park does not weaken it, it feeds it. But there is another early scandal that deserves attention, one that did not involve any external watchdog group or offended institution, but instead involved the show deliberately antagonizing its own audience, the very people who had made it a phenomenon. On April 1st, 1998, the second season of South Park was scheduled to premiere. Fans had spent 5 weeks in a state of genuine anticipation because the first season had ended with one of the most effective cliffhangers in television history. The final episode, titled Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, had posed a single question: who is Cartman's father? The question consumed message boards, which in 1998 were the primary venue for fan speculation. Theories proliferated. Bets were placed. The premiere date was circled on calendars. And then, on April 1st, Comedy Central aired the season premiere. And it was not the resolution of the cliffhanger. It was not about Cartman at all. It was an episode called Terrence and Philip in Not Without My Anus, a standalone adventure featuring the show's Canadian flatulence comedians in a plot involving Saddam Hussein attempting to take over Canada. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny did not appear. The cliffhanger was not addressed. The question of Cartman's father was not answered. The episode was, in every respect, an elaborate April Fool's Day prank, timed to land on the one date in the calendar when pranks are expected but rarely delivered at scale. The response was volcanic. Comedy Central received over 2,000 angry emails within a single week. Phone lines were flooded. Fans who had organized viewing parties felt personally betrayed. Media outlets reported the backlash with a mixture of amusement and genuine surprise at the intensity of the anger. Diane Wirtz of Newsday captured the mood when she wrote that fans rioted, that some jumped ship and never came back, and that the lesson was simple: pay off expectations or suffer the consequences. The grudge persisted for years. Multiple media outlets noted that some fans harbored resentment toward the show more than half a decade after the episode aired, a remarkable duration for anger directed at a cartoon. Matt Stone's response, delivered in Entertainment Weekly, was characteristically unsympathetic. He said that if someone gets that angry because they do not know who a little construction paper kid's father is, then there is really something wrong with them. The Terrence and Philip prank is significant not because of the episode itself, which is a minor entry in the show's catalog, but because of what it reveals about the relationship between Parker and Stone and their audience. The relationship is not one of service. It is not one of gratitude. It is not one in which the creators feel obligated to deliver what the audience expects. The relationship is adversarial, playful, and fundamentally asymmetric. Parker and Stone have something the audience wants, which is the next episode, and they have no compunction about withholding it, misdirecting it, or using the audience's own expectations as raw material for the joke. The prank also nearly cost them their positions. Reports suggest that Parker and Stone came close to being fired over the incident, a consequence that would have ended the show less than 2 years into its run. Comedy Central chose not to fire them, a decision that, in retrospect, was one of the most consequential in the network's history. The show returned the following week, with Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, which resolved the cliffhanger, and the audience, having absorbed its punishment, came back. The dynamic was established. South Park does not exist to please its audience. It exists to provoke its audience. And if the audience happens to be pleased by the provocation, that is a bonus, not a goal. The Terrence and Philip prank was the first time the show directed its capacity for provocation inward, at the people who loved it most, and it would not be the last. The first scandal that truly penetrated the broader culture came not from a watchdog group, but from the show itself, and it came in the form of a single word repeated 162 times. On June 20th, 2001, the 5th season premiere of South Park aired under the title, It Hits the Fan. The premise was deceptively simple, almost academic in its precision. A fictional television show, modeled loosely on NYPD Blue, decides to broadcast the word shit uncensored for the first time, and the entire town of South Park loses its mind with excitement. The people of South Park celebrate. They throw parties. They embrace the word as a kind of liberation. And the episode then proceeds to use the word shit, uncensored, 162 times in roughly 22 minutes of airtime. A counter appears in the corner of the screen, tallying each utterance with the methodical precision of a scientific instrument. The word is spoken, shouted, whispered, and sung. It is used as a noun, a verb, an adjective, and an exclamation. It is pluralized, compounded, and conjugated. By the time the counter stops, the episode has made its point with a kind of exhaustive, almost pedantic thoroughness. The point is not the word itself. The point is that the word is just a word, that the power attributed to it is manufactured and arbitrary, and that the panic surrounding its use is a more interesting phenomenon than the word could ever be on its own. What is striking about this episode, what gives it its particular significance in the history of South Park scandals, is not the profanity. It is the reaction, or rather the absence of reaction. Despite the fact that a basic cable show had just broadcast a single profanity more times in one episode than most shows use in an entire season, the public response was muted. The PTC condemned it, as they condemned everything. But no advertiser pulled out. No congressional hearing was called. No regulatory action was taken. Co-creator Matt Stone noted the absence of outrage with something like bewilderment, observing that the standards were almost gone and that no one seemed to care anymore. Comedy Central executives, for their part, had approved the episode in advance, feeling that the profanity was justified by its satirical context. Even they were surprised that they had approved it. This was perhaps the first clear sign of something that would become a defining feature of South Park scandals. The show did not just push boundaries. It revealed that many of the boundaries people believed existed were already gone. The outrage it provoked was often less about what the show had done and more about the uncomfortable realization that nobody was going to stop it. The boundary was an illusion, and the show's gift, or its cruelty, depending on perspective, was making that illusion visible. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this reresis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The same year that It Hits the Fan aired, South Park broadcast an episode that would become, in retrospect, one of the most significant in the entire series, though almost nobody noticed at the time. On July 4th, 2001, the episode Super Best Friends debuted as the 3rd episode of the 5th season. The premise involves the boys encountering a group of religious figures who have formed a superhero team, a parody of the DC Comics Super Friends. The team includes Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Joseph Smith, Lao Tzu, Krishna, and Muhammad. Muhammad is depicted as a superhero with the power of flame, and he appears on screen fully animated, speaking, fighting alongside the other religious figures, and treated with exactly the same irreverence as every other character in the episode. There is no censorship. There is no black bar. There is no audio bleep. There is no disclaimer. There is no special warning before the broadcast. Muhammad simply appears as a character in the episode, one figure among many, and the episode moves on. Nobody said a word. No organization filed a complaint. No threat was issued. No network executive intervened. The episode aired. It reran. It was included in DVD box sets. It was available on streaming platforms. And the world moved on. This detail matters enormously because everything that would happen later with South Park and Muhammad, the censorship, the death threats, the FBI investigations, the federal prison sentences, cannot be fully understood without knowing that it had already happened once before, without incident. The line that would later be treated as absolute, as physically dangerous to cross, had already been crossed, in plain view, in prime time, and the crossing had been met with silence. The line did not exist in 2001. It came into existence later, after the Danish cartoon controversy of 2005, after the assassination of Theo van Gogh in 2004, after the geopolitical landscape shifted in ways that made certain images more charged than they had been before. The Super Best Friends episode is a timestamp, a record of a world in which depicting Muhammad in a cartoon was a non-event, a fact so unremarkable that nobody thought to remark on it. That world is gone now, and the episode itself has been pulled from every platform, retroactively made dangerous by events that had not yet occurred when it aired. But before the Muhammad controversy would erupt into something genuinely dangerous, South Park found itself embroiled in a different kind of scandal, one that had less to do with religion or politics, and more to do with the raw capacity of the show to disturb on a visceral, almost primal level. On July 11th, 2001, the episode Scott Tenorman Must Die aired as the 4th episode of the 5th season. It is widely considered a turning point for the character of Eric Cartman and for the show as a whole. The moment when Cartman transitioned from a bratty, bigoted child into something genuinely sociopathic. The plot begins simply enough, almost innocuously. Cartman buys pubic hair from an older boy named Scott Tenorman for $10, believing this will prove he has reached puberty. When the other boys explain that pubic hair must be grown, not purchased, Cartman tries to get his money back. Scott refuses and humiliates Cartman repeatedly, burning the money in front of him, tricking him into further losses, and reducing him to tears of frustrated rage. What follows is a slow, methodical escalation of revenge that builds across the episode's runtime with the patient logic of a chess game being played by someone who does not recognize moral constraints. Cartman arranges for a local farmer to shoot Scott Tenorman's parents for trespassing on his property. He then retrieves their bodies, grinds them into meat, cooks the meat into chili, and enters the chili into a local cook-off where Scott Tenorman is a judge. Scott eats the chili. He compliments it. And then Cartman reveals what is in it. Scott discovers a finger in his bowl. He realizes what has happened. He begins to sob, and Cartman, standing over him, licks the tears from his face and declares them delicious. The moment is played not for horror, but for triumph, which makes it more horrifying than any horror film could achieve, because the audience is positioned, however uncomfortably, to admire the architecture of the revenge, even as they recoil from its content. The creators later revealed that they debated internally whether the episode went too far. They decided it did not, as long as Cartman did not personally pull the trigger on Scott's parents. The farmer kills them. Cartman merely orchestrates the circumstances and profits from the result. The distinction seems almost absurd in context. A moral hair split so finely it is nearly invisible. But it reveals something important about how Parker and Stone think about their own show. There is always a line. They are always aware of it. But the line is never where anyone else would put it. Their sense of what constitutes going too far is calibrated to an internal standard that does not correspond to any external measure of taste, decency, or acceptability. And that internal standard, applied consistently for nearly 30 years, is what gives South Park its peculiar authority. The show is not reckless. It is precise. The offense is intentional, and the intention is specific, even when the specificity is difficult for the audience to detect. The impact of Scott Tenorman Must Die extended beyond the episode itself. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of Eric Cartman as a character, and in doing so, it altered the trajectory of the show. Before Scott Tenorman, Cartman was a bully, a bigot, a liar, and a manipulator, but he was contained. His schemes failed as often as they succeeded. His cruelty had limits, even if those limits were further out than any reasonable person would place them. After Scott Tenorman, those limits ceased to exist. Cartman had murdered, albeit indirectly, and he had enjoyed it. He had not merely enjoyed it, he had savored it. Literally and figuratively, licking tears from the face of the person he had destroyed. The episode gave the character permission to be anything, and in subsequent seasons, Cartman would exploit that permission fully, manipulating Butters into believing the world had ended, starting a hate group, faking disability, orchestrating elaborate conspiracies, and committing acts of cruelty that escalated with each passing year. The trajectory from Scott Tenorman Must Die to the Cartman of later seasons is a straight line, and it is a line that the creators drew deliberately, knowing that a character who has already committed the worst possible act cannot be restrained by conventional narrative boundaries. Cartman became, in the years after Scott Tenorman, a kind of test case for how far an audience is willing to follow a character they know to be evil, how much they will laugh at actions they know to be monstrous, and what that laughter reveals about the people doing it. The answer, as 25 years of ratings have confirmed, is that the audience will follow Cartman almost anywhere, and the laughter does not stop. And whatever that says about the audience is something the audience would rather not examine too closely. The year 2001 also brought South Park's first direct engagement with a real-world catastrophe, one that tested the show's commitment to irreverence under conditions where irreverence carried genuine risk. On November 7th, 2001, less than 2 months after the September 11th attacks, the episode Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants aired. The title alone was a statement of intent. While the rest of American media was still navigating the delicate question of how to address the attacks and their aftermath, South Park reduced the mastermind of the worst terrorist attack in American history to a figure of childish ridicule. The episode depicts bin Laden as a buffoon, subjecting him to a series of slapstick humiliations modeled directly on classic Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck cartoons. He is outsmarted by elementary school children. His anatomy is mocked. He is ultimately killed by a U.S. military airstrike. The episode also includes Afghan children who mirror the South Park boys, a gesture towards shared humanity that sits alongside the crude mockery without contradiction. The decision to air the episode so soon after September 11th was risky. American audiences were raw. Patriotism was intense and often inflexible. Criticism of the government or the military was treated in many quarters as tantamount to treason. But Parker and Stone calculated, correctly, that mockery of bin Laden would be received not as insensitivity, but as catharsis. The episode was widely praised. IGN gave it a 9 out of 10 and described it as an accurate and thoughtful appraisal of the national mood. The episode demonstrated something that South Park would prove repeatedly in the years ahead. The show's irreverence is not the same as indifference. Parker and Stone are not nihilists. They have positions, they have values, and they express those values through provocation. The provocation is the method. The values are the message. The 1999 theatrical film, South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, deserves attention here, even though it predates some of the show's most famous scandals, because it established the template for the show's relationship with institutional censorship in a way that shaped everything that followed. The film was submitted to the Motion Picture Association of America for rating 6 separate times. Each time, it was returned with an NC-17 rating, which would have effectively barred it from wide theatrical distribution. The objection was the film's profanity. Parker and Stone engaged in a prolonged negotiation with the MPAA, cutting and revising and resubmitting, each time testing exactly where the boundary lay. The final version of the film contains 399 swear words. The number is not accidental. 400, according to the MPAA's guidelines, would have triggered an automatic NC-17. Parker and Stone stopped 1 word short. The precision is characteristic. They did not simply defy the rating system. They gamed it, found its exact limits, and stood on the edge. Matt Stone called the MPAA a bumbling, irresponsible organization and told Entertainment Weekly that the film was nothing more than a big middle finger to the MPAA, paid for with Paramount's money. The statement is revealing not just for its hostility, but for its honesty. Stone is acknowledging that the film's relationship with censorship is not incidental to its content. It is its content. The movie itself is about censorship, about a group of parents who blame a Canadian comedy show called Terrence and Philip for corrupting their children and launch an actual war against Canada in response. The parents in the film form a group called Mothers Against Canada. They lobby politicians. They whip up public sentiment. They start a military conflict that escalates to the point of global catastrophe. And the entire time, their children, the children they are supposedly protecting, are perfectly capable of distinguishing between fiction and reality, between a vulgar cartoon and actual behavior. The parents in the film are doing, within the fiction, exactly what the MPAA was doing in reality, exactly what the Parents Television Council was doing in reality, exactly what every moral watchdog organization in the country was doing in reality. attempting to suppress material they found offensive on the grounds that it might influence children, without considering whether the suppression itself, the war itself, the crusade itself, might be the more harmful act. The film earned over $80 million worldwide against a production budget of $21 million. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song for Blame Canada, a nomination that placed South Park's critique of censorship inside the very institution that censorship was supposed to protect. Jack Valenti, who at the time was the president of the MPAA, publicly stated that the film should have received an NC-17 rating, confirming that the organization's leader believed his own organization had made the wrong call. The admission was extraordinary, a regulator publicly second-guessing his own regulation, and it only reinforced Parker and Stone's argument that the rating system was arbitrary, inconsistent, and governed more by institutional anxiety than by coherent principle. The film also introduced the character of Saddam Hussein as Satan's abusive romantic partner, a depiction that placed the then-sitting dictator of Iraq in a homosexual relationship with the devil, and portrayed him as manipulative, emotionally needy, and obsessed with physical intimacy. The depiction was extreme, even by South Park standards, and it arrived at a moment when Hussein was still in power, still a geopolitical figure, still a name that appeared in presidential briefings and United Nations resolutions. The film did not treat him as a political figure. It treated him as a bad boyfriend. The reduction was the point. By placing Hussein in a domestic comedy with Satan, the film stripped him of the gravitas that dictators depend on, replacing menace with absurdity, replacing fear with embarrassment. The strategy was the same one the show would later employ with Osama bin Laden, and it reflects a consistent belief on the part of Parker and Stone that ridicule is a more effective weapon against tyrants than outrage, that being laughed at is worse than being denounced, and that the most subversive thing you can do to a powerful person is refuse to take them seriously. The Oscar nomination brought Parker and Stone to the 72nd Academy Awards on March 26, 2000. And what they did there became one of the most famous moments in the show's off-screen history. They arrived on the red carpet wearing replicas of famous dresses. Parker wore a version of the green Versace dress that Jennifer Lopez had worn to the Grammy Awards, one of the most photographed garments of the era. Stone wore a version of the pink Ralph Lauren gown that Gwyneth Paltrow had worn when she won her Academy Award the previous year. Both dresses were low-rent approximations, deliberately cheap-looking, deliberately ill-fitting, and worn with complete seriousness. Parker and Stone walked the red carpet, posed for photographs, and gave bland, generic responses to interviewers, committing fully to the bit while offering no explanation for it. They were also, by their own later admission, under the influence of LSD during the entire ceremony. The stunt outraged some attendees and delighted others. Jennifer Lopez, upon encountering Stone at a party after the ceremony, reportedly pushed him. Gloria Estefan was described as furious. Academy members were sufficiently unhappy that Parker and Stone have suggested the stunt may have contributed to them being effectively blacklisted from the Oscars in subsequent years. Michael Caine, by contrast, thought it was hilarious. The incident captures something essential about Parker and Stone's relationship with the entertainment industry they inhabit. They are inside it. They benefit from its infrastructure, its money, its awards, and they have absolutely no interest in performing the rituals of respect that the industry demands from its participants. The Oscars dress stunt was not just a prank. It was a statement about the gap between what Hollywood claims to value and what it actually values, between the progressive ideals it performs on camera and the rigid hierarchies it enforces off camera. The statement was delivered not through dialogue or narrative, but through the simple act of showing up to the most prestigious event in the industry, wearing the wrong clothes, and refusing to pretend that the clothes matter. And this is where the story of South Park's scandals begins to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. From a story about a show that provokes the world into a story about a show that the world provokes back. Because what the early scandals established, from the PTC campaigns to the It Hits the Fan profanity count to the MPAA negotiations, was a dynamic in which the show acted and the world reacted, in which Parker and Stone threw stones and the targets absorbed them or threw them back. But what the later scandals would reveal, increasingly, and and with growing clarity, is that the world is not a passive target. It throws its own stones. It creates its own provocations. And some of those provocations are bigger, stranger, and more consequential than anything a television show can produce. The challenge for South Park, the challenge it has faced with increasing difficulty as the decades have passed, is to remain more provocative than the reality it satirizes. To find the edge of a world that keeps moving its edges further out. To say something that the culture has not already said louder, cruder, and more absurdly than any cartoon ever could. That challenge is the engine of the show's later scandals, and it is a challenge that the show does not always win. The celebrity controversies run through South Park's history like a thread, and they deserve extended treatment because they represent a distinct category of scandal, one in which the show's targets have names, publicists, and lawyers. South Park has satirized hundreds of public figures over its run, but certain depictions have generated responses that transcended the usual cycle of outrage and forgetfulness. The Paris Hilton episode, Stupid Spoiled Whore Video Playset, aired in the 8th season and depicted Hilton opening a store in South Park that glamorizes hypersexualized fame for young girls. The episode features Hilton's dog Tinkerbell being shot and killed, and it culminates in a grotesque endurance contest between Hilton and the character Mr. Slave that ends in a manner so obscene that describing it in detail would undermine the meditative quality of this video. Hilton later wrote in her 2023 memoir that the episode made her feel sick and that she was upset because the insult applied to her was extended to other young women, including Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, and Tara Reid. When Matt Stone was informed of Hilton's relatively muted reaction at the time of the original airing, he said it proved how troubled she was. The exchange reveals something about the power dynamic that South Park establishes with its celebrity targets. The show does not simply mock a celebrity. It creates a situation in which any response from the celebrity becomes additional evidence for the show's premise. Silence is interpreted as evidence. Anger is interpreted as evidence. Even a calm, measured response is interpreted as evidence. The celebrity is placed inside a frame from which no exit exists. The Britney Spears episode arrived 3 years later. Britney's New Look, the second episode of the 12th season, aired on March 19, 2008, during the period when Spears' public breakdown was the dominant narrative of American tabloid culture. In the episode, Spears attempts suicide and survives with catastrophic injuries. Rather than offering her compassion, the media and the townspeople of South Park parade her as a spectacle, photographing her, mocking her, and refusing to look away. The boys witness this exploitation with growing revulsion, but are powerless to stop it. The episode is structured as a retelling of Shirley Jackson's famous short story, The Lottery, in which a community ritually sacrifices one of its members through a process that appears, from inside the community, to be both normal and necessary. The parallel is made explicit in the episode's final moments, when it is revealed that Britney's destruction is a literal sacrifice, one performed annually by the American public, and that the next victim has already been selected. The camera settles on a young Miley Cyrus. The episode aired in March 2008. By the end of that year, the tabloid attention that had consumed Britney Spears had indeed begun to shift toward Cyrus, who was then 15 years old. The episode is one of South Park's bleakest, and it is notable for the fact that it is not really making fun of Britney Spears at all. It is making fun of everyone who is making fun of Britney Spears, which, in 2008, was essentially everyone. The satire is aimed not at the celebrity, but at the audience, at the culture that consumes celebrities and then discards them, and at the media apparatus that facilitates the consumption and profits from the discard. The episode is uncomfortable because it implicates the viewer. You are not watching someone else's cruelty. You are watching your own. The Britney Spears episode accomplished something that very few South Park episodes have managed before or since. It made the audience feel guilty. Not guilty for watching the episode. Guilty for watching Britney Spears. Guilty for reading the tabloids. Guilty for clicking on the photographs. Guilty for participating, even passively, in the machine that the episode depicts. The episode does not moralize. It does not lecture. It simply shows the machine from the outside, with the same flat, crude animation it uses for everything else, and lets the viewer recognize themselves inside it. The recognition is the discomfort, and the discomfort is the point. The episode aired at a time when Spears' breakdown was being covered with an intensity that would, in retrospect, come to be understood as a form of collective cruelty, a recognition that the Free Britney movement of the late 2000s and early 2020s would eventually articulate in political terms. South Park articulated it first, in 2008, 12 years before the rest of the culture caught up, and it did so not through advocacy or activism, but through the simple act of turning the camera around. When Spears' conservatorship was finally terminated in November 2021, and the public conversation shifted from mockery to accountability, from entertainment to justice, the Britney's New Look episode resurfaced in the discourse as a piece of evidence. A document that proved that someone had seen what was happening in real time and had said so, clearly and publicly, on national television. And that the someone was not a journalist, not an activist, not a lawyer, but a crudely animated cartoon that most serious cultural commentators had long since dismissed as juvenile. The episode had not changed between 2008 and 2021. The culture had changed around it, rotating slowly until the episode's perspective, which had once seemed harsh and exaggerated, aligned precisely with the consensus view. The alignment was not accidental. It was the result of the episode having been right from the beginning, right about the machine, right about the sacrifice, right about the next victim, and right about the audience's complicity in all of it. The fact that it took 13 years for the rest of the culture to arrive at the same conclusion is itself a data point, one that says less about South Park's prescience than about the culture's capacity for delayed recognition, its tendency to know something is wrong long before it admits it, and its preference for retrospective outrage over real-time accountability. The 16th season, which aired in 2012, brought an episode that engaged with a question South Park had been circling for years, but had never addressed so directly. The question of whether the culture itself was getting worse, whether the collective standards of taste and decency were declining in measurable and irreversible ways, and whether anyone was capable of doing anything about it. The 9th episode of that season, Raising the Bar, aired on October 3rd, 2012, and it used two seemingly unrelated storylines to construct an argument about the architecture of cultural decline. In the first storyline, Cartman accepts that he is obese and decides he is entitled to use a motorized mobility scooter, a decision that is immediately embraced by obese people throughout the country who begin riding scooters through every public space, treating their condition not as a health problem to be addressed, but as a disability to be accommodated. The episode then introduces Honey Boo Boo, the child reality television star whose show, Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, had become one of the most watched and most discussed programs on American television in 2012, a phenomenon that many cultural commentators cited as evidence that the medium had reached a new low. The animated Honey Boo Boo is pitted against Cartman in a spaghetti wrestling match on the White House South Lawn, a spectacle that the episode presents as the logical endpoint of a culture that has abandoned every standard it once claimed to uphold. The second storyline involves Kyle growing increasingly distressed about the state of the culture and appealing to James Cameron, the filmmaker, to do something about it. Cameron responds by literally diving to the bottom of the ocean in a submarine to find the bar, the metaphorical standard of cultural acceptability, which has sunk so low that it now rests on the ocean floor. Cameron's mission to raise the bar is presented as heroic, absurd, and ultimately futile, because every time he lifts the bar a few inches, the culture pushes it back down. The reference to Cameron is rooted in his real-world deep-sea expeditions, particularly his 2012 solo dive to the Mariana Trench, which the episode uses as raw material for a commentary on the gap between genuine achievement and the cultural conditions that make genuine achievement invisible. Cameron is trying to raise the bar. Nobody else is helping, and the bar keeps sinking because the forces pushing it down, the reality television, the scooter culture, the celebration of ignorance and excess, are stronger than any individual effort to resist them. June Thompson, the real mother of Honey Boo Boo, objected to the episode, describing its portrayal of her family as trashy. The objection was noted and absorbed. The episode won the 2013 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, its second Emmy in that category, a distinction that placed the Academy's endorsement alongside the complaint of the person the episode had satirized, creating one of those ironies that South Park specializes in producing. The award validated the satire, the complaint validated the target, and the gap between the two, between institutional recognition and personal offense, is the gap in which all of South Park's most effective work operates. The episode is also significant because it represents one of the few times that South South Park directed its satire not at a specific individual, institution, or ideology, but at the culture as a whole, at the collective decision to accept less, to celebrate less, to tolerate less, and to call the result progress. The argument is conservative in the classical sense, a lament for standards that have been abandoned, and it sits uncomfortably alongside the show's general reputation as a vehicle for pushing boundaries. Because pushing boundaries and lowering standards are, in certain lights, the same thing, and the episode's willingness to acknowledge that tension is part of what makes it honest. The Kanye West saga began with Fish Sticks, which aired in the 13th season in 2009. The episode involves a simple joke. Do you like fish sticks? Yes. Do you like putting fish sticks in your mouth? Yes. Then what are you? A gay fish that sweeps the nation. Everyone finds it hilarious, except Kanye West, who cannot understand why people keep calling him a gay fish. The animated West grows increasingly agitated, consults advisors, hires investigators, and ultimately embraces his identity as a gay fish, diving into the ocean at the episode's conclusion to live among the creatures of the deep. The real Kanye West responded on his blog within a day of the episode's broadcast, writing that the show had murdered him and that it was pretty funny, but that his feelings were hurt. Parker and Stone said they were surprised by West's response and felt that Carlos Mencia, who is also parodied in the episode as a joke thief, was treated far more harshly. West later referenced the episode in his 2010 song Gorgeous, with a line about choking a South Park writer with a fish stick, suggesting that the sting of the parody persisted longer than his initial blog post acknowledged. The show returned to West in the season 17 episode The Hobbit, in which the animated West repeatedly tries to convince people that his wife, Kim Kardashian, is not a hobbit. Each attempt to defend her produces additional evidence that she is, in fact, a hobbit, and the episode ends with West reading a story about Kardashian being a hobbit to himself. The personal nature of the attack, targeting not just West, but his wife and the gap between their public image and their physical reality, represented an escalation that drew attention even by South Park standards. The Kanye episodes illustrate a principle that governs much of the show's celebrity satire. The target's response becomes part of the narrative. West's blog post, his song lyric, his public defensiveness about his image, all of it feeds back into the show's portrayal, creating a loop in which the celebrity and the satire are locked in a relationship that neither can exit. The show creates a version of the celebrity. The celebrity reacts to that version. The show incorporates the reaction. The celebrity reacts again. The cycle has no natural stopping point. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, subscribing really does help us continue making these long videos. It is free and takes just a moment. But to understand why the period that followed was so intense, it helps to understand the position that Parker and Stone occupied by the early 2000s. They were no longer newcomers. They were no longer underdogs. They had a hit show, a successful film, an Oscar nomination, and a cultural profile that placed them among the most recognizable figures in American entertainment. And yet they continued to behave as if they had nothing to lose, as if each season might be their last, as if the show's survival depended on maintaining a level of provocation that most creators would have abandoned the moment they had something to protect. The refusal to soften is the defining characteristic of South Park's middle period, the years between the early experiments of the first 4 seasons and the mature, serialized storytelling of the later ones. During this period, roughly 2001 to 2010, the show produced its most famous episodes, its most consequential controversies, and its most sustained engagements with the institutions, religions, celebrities, and governments that would become its permanent adversaries. The period is dense, the scandals overlap, and the cumulative effect is one of relentless, almost exhausting provocation, as if Parker and Stone were testing not just the limits of public tolerance, but their own capacity for generating outrage. The years between 2001 and 2005 were a period of relentless escalation for South Park, and the scandals accumulated with a regularity that began to seem almost deliberate, as if Parker and Stone had internalized a production rhythm in which each season required at least one episode that would generate national conversation. In 2002, the 6th season opened with Jared Has AIDS, a play on words involving Subway spokesman Jared Fogle and the disease AIDS. The episode was originally titled Subway Sandwiches Gave Jared AIDS, but Comedy Central's advertising department intervened, informing Parker that Subway was one of the network's biggest sponsors and that the word Subway could not be used disparagingly on the air. Parker's response was to finish the episode at the last minute, a tactic that bypassed the normal review process and presented the network with a choice between airing the episode as submitted or leaving a hole in the broadcast schedule. The episode aired on March 6th, 2002, with the Subway references intact. Nobody sued. Subway did not pull its advertising, and the episode sat in the South Park catalog as a mildly controversial curiosity for 13 years, until 2015, when Jared Fogle was arrested and convicted for child sex crimes, and the episode suddenly seemed less like a random joke and more like a piece of accidental prophecy. The show had depicted a children's spokesman as someone with an unhealthy interest in children, and the joke turned out to be, in the most unsettling possible way, correct. The same season also brought Red Hot Catholic Love, the 8th episode, which aired on July 3rd, 2002, and which addressed the Catholic priest abuse scandal that was dominating headlines at the time. In the episode, the parents of South Park grow concerned about whether their local priest, Father Maxey, has been molesting their children. Father Maxey, who is portrayed as one of the few genuinely moral priests in the show's universe, travels to the Vatican to confront the growing problem of child molestation within the church. Once there, he discovers that priests from around the world are not only aware of the abuse, but actively engaged in it, and that they justify their behavior by citing a fictional holy document of Vatican law that supposedly permits their actions. The Pope himself is depicted as complicit in the cover-up. The episode was selected as number 2 on a list of the 10 South Park episodes that changed the world, and its impact was amplified by the fact that it aired during the same period when the real-world Catholic abuse scandal was being reported with increasing frequency and urgency. The Catholic League condemned the episode, as it condemned most things that South Park did involving the church, but the condemnation carried less weight than it might have in a different context, because the facts the episode satirized were, by that point, a matter of public record. Parker and Stone were not inventing a scandal. They were depicting one that already existed, and the church's objection to the depiction served mainly to highlight the gap between its stated values and its documented behavior. The episode is also notable for a subplot in which the townspeople discover that putting food in the rectum causes excrement to emerge from the mouth. A bit of trademark crudeness that serves no satirical purpose whatsoever, but which ensures that nobody can accuse the episode of being sanctimonious. This is a recurring strategy in South Park's most pointed social commentary. The show undermines its own moral authority in advance, preemptively disqualifying itself from the position of moral superiority. And in doing so, it makes its argument more persuasive, because an argument that does not claim to come from a place of virtue is harder to dismiss as hypocrisy. The same season brought The Death Camp of Tolerance, the 14th episode of the 6th season, which aired on November 20th, 2002, and which stands as one of the most conceptually audacious episodes in the show's history. The plot involves Mr. Garrison attempting to get fired from his teaching position by behaving in an overtly and explicitly sexual manner in front of his students. His plan is to be fired for being gay, then sue the school for discrimination, and collect $25 million. The episode introduces the character of Mr. Slave and features a subplot in which the class gerbil, Lemmiwinks, is inserted into Mr. Slave's body and must navigate his digestive system in a parody of The Hobbit. The children, traumatized by what they have witnessed, complain to their parents. The parents, misinterpreting the complaints as homophobia, send the children to a tolerance camp that operates with the aesthetics and discipline of a Nazi concentration camp. The episode's argument is that there is a difference between tolerance and acceptance. That tolerance is the willingness to acknowledge that different people exist, while acceptance is the demand that everyone celebrate everything, and that the latter can become a form of coercion as oppressive as the intolerance it claims to oppose. The argument is delivered inside a framework so deliberately offensive that it forces the viewer to either engage with the idea or reject the episode entirely, which is, of course, exactly the choice the episode is about. In 2003, the 7th season brought Crazy Cripples, an episode that took aim at Christopher Reeve and the stem cell research debate. The episode aired on March 26, 2003. Parker and Stone had been developing the concept for years, but had hesitated, concerned about the potential backlash of satirizing a man in a wheelchair. In the episode, Reeve campaigns for stem cell research and, by extracting juices from human fetuses, regains not only his mobility, but actual superpowers reminiscent of his most famous role. He becomes addicted to the power and assembles a legion of doom. The creators said they finally committed to the episode after watching Reeve on Larry King Live and feeling that his public persona had become self-entitled compared to people born with disabilities. People like Timmy and Jimmy, who had never known life without limitation and who did not define themselves by what they had lost. The distinction is the episode's thesis. There is a difference between acquiring a disability and being born with one, and the public discourse around disability, which at the time was heavily focused on Reeve's advocacy, tended to erase that difference. The episode offended disability advocates and Reeve supporters alike, but it also prompted a conversation that nobody else in mainstream media was willing to initiate. The same 7th season also brought All About Mormons, the 12th episode, which aired on November 19th, 2003, and which represents one of the more nuanced entries in South Park's long history of religious satire. The episode follows a Mormon family that moves to South Park, and through a series of flashbacks, it tells the story of Joseph Smith's founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, including the golden plates, the seer stones, and the translation process that produced the Book of Mormon. The flashbacks are accompanied by a musical narration that repeatedly interrupts the story to point out its implausibility, with characters singing about how obviously fabricated the whole thing sounds. And yet, the episode does something unexpected with this material. The Mormon family is depicted as genuinely kind, generous, and happy. They are good neighbors. They are good parents. Their children are well-adjusted and likable. The episode's conclusion, delivered by the Mormon boy Gary, is a direct challenge to the audience. He acknowledges that the story of Joseph Smith sounds absurd, and then he points out that his family is happy, that Mormonism makes their lives better, and that if the audience has a problem with that, the problem is theirs, not his. The speech is delivered without irony. It is one of the few moments in South Park history where a character makes a sincere, moral argument and is not undercut by the show. Parker later revealed that many of his Mormon friends found the episode hilarious, and that the episode's themes became the foundation for the Book of Mormon, the Broadway musical he and Stone created with Robert Lopez, which opened in 2011 and won 9 Tony Awards. The journey from a single South Park episode to one of the most successful musicals in Broadway history is a trajectory that nobody could have predicted, and it suggests that Parker and Stone's engagement with Mormonism was not dismissive, but genuinely curious, a fascination with a belief system that produces demonstrably good people from demonstrably implausible premises. The tension between those two facts is the engine of both the episode and the musical, and neither work resolves the tension. They simply hold it up and let the audience sit with the discomfort. The 9th season premiere itself had generated a controversy of a different sort, one that had less to do with ideology and more to do with the raw, physical limits of what a television audience could be asked to look at. Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina aired on March 9th, 2005, and it opened the season with a storyline in which Mr. Garrison undergoes sex reassignment surgery. The episode is notable not for its premise, which is provocative, but within the range of topics South Park had already explored, but for its execution. Parker and Stone had filmed real sex reassignment surgery footage and planned to include over 5 minutes of it in the episode, intercutting between the live-action medical procedure and the animated Mr. Garrison narrating his experience from the operating table. The footage was graphic in a way that animation alone could never achieve. It was not drawn. It was not stylized. It was a camera pointed at a real human body undergoing a real surgical procedure, and it was embedded inside a cartoon about elementary school children. Comedy Central intervened, as they rarely did, and demanded that the footage be cut. The final broadcast version retained only 3 brief shots, each lasting approximately 1 second. But even those abbreviated glimpses were enough to make the episode one of the most physically uncomfortable viewing experiences in the show's history. Matt Stone later explained that the footage had originally run for about a minute and consisted of Mr. Garrison narrating over the entire thing, and that the network's intervention had, in this case, probably been the correct call. The episode also features parallel storylines in which Kyle undergoes a surgical procedure to become tall and black so that he can play basketball, and Kyle's father Gerald undergoes what the show calls a dolphinoplasty, surgically altering his appearance to resemble a dolphin. The parallels are the episode's argument. If gender can be surgically reassigned, why not race? If race, why not species? The comparisons are deliberately absurd, and they are deliberately offensive, and they were received as both. Transgender advocacy groups objected to the implication that gender transition is comparable to wanting to be a dolphin. The objection was substantive and widely shared, and it represents one of the clearer cases in South Park's history where the satirical framework the show employed was perceived not as illuminating, but as reductive, collapsing a complex human experience into a punchline that did not account for the reality of the people it depicted. Parker later admitted that making the episode was one of the most stressful production experiences of his career, and that he came close to giving up on South Park entirely during its creation. Both Parker and Stone have subsequently acknowledged being unhappy with how transphobic the episode came across. The admission is unusual for creators who have generally stood behind even their most controversial work, and it suggests that the episode crossed a line that even they, with their idiosyncratic and internally calibrated sense of where lines belong, eventually recognized as real. The question of disability had surfaced earlier, in a quieter but no less significant way, when the character of Timmy Birch was introduced in Season 4. A boy with an unspecified cognitive disability whose vocabulary consists almost entirely of his own name. Comedy Central executives grew nervous. Some felt the character promoted stereotypes about people with disabilities and could generate a public relations disaster. There were internal discussions about removing Timmy from the show entirely. Parker and Stone pushed back, arguing that the other children in the show treated Timmy as an equal, that his disability was never the punchline of any joke, and that removing him would be the truly discriminatory act. The act of erasing a disabled character from a fictional world because his presence made non-disabled executives uncomfortable. The character stayed, and when Jimmy Valmer, a boy with cerebral palsy who performs stand-up comedy, was introduced in the 5th season's Cripple Fight, the show's treatment of disability actually drew praise from some disabled viewers and advocacy groups. The episode, which aired on June 27, 2001, features a prolonged fistfight between Timmy and Jimmy, modeled shot for shot after the famous alley brawl in the science fiction film They Live. The fight is brutal, absurd, and strangely beautiful, and it ends with a joint declaration of disability pride. It is simultaneously ridiculous and sincere, which is perhaps the most accurate description of South Park's entire approach to subjects that other shows refuse to touch. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this, a quick subscribe really does make a difference. It is completely free, and it helps us keep making these long videos. The question of what South Park does to its celebrity targets, and what celebrity targets do in response, would recur with every passing season. But the pattern established in these early cases never fundamentally changed. The show identifies a public figure whose behavior or public persona contains a contradiction. It isolates the contradiction. It exaggerates the contradiction until the exaggeration becomes indistinguishable from the original, and then it waits. The target either responds, which validates the satire by proving the target cares enough to react, or does not respond, which validates the satire by suggesting the target cannot mount a defense. The dynamic is asymmetrical by design. South Park holds all the cards. The show can say anything it wants about a celebrity, and the celebrity's options are limited to silence, anger, or humor, none of which actually changes what the show has said. The celebrity cannot edit the episode. The celebrity cannot force a retraction. The celebrity cannot sue because satire is protected speech under American law, and the show's crude animation style, which renders every person as a simplified cutout figure, provides an additional layer of legal insulation by making it clear that no reasonable viewer could mistake the depiction for a factual representation. The legal protection is robust. The emotional protection is non-existent. And the gap between the two, the gap between what the law allows and what the heart can absorb, is the space in which all of South Park's celebrity controversies occur. In 2004, the 8th season brought The Passion of the Jew, which aired on March 31st, 2004, in the midst of the cultural firestorm surrounding Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ. South Park's response to the controversy was characteristically multi-directional. In the episode, Stan and Kenny see the film, hate it, and travel to Hollywood to demand their money back from Mel Gibson. Cartman, meanwhile, sees the film and interprets it as an endorsement of anti-Semitism, which he uses as the basis for a neo-Nazi movement disguised as a Passion fan club. Kyle sees the film and is so disturbed by its depiction of Jewish culpability in the death of Jesus that he begins having nightmares. And Gibson himself is portrayed as a screaming, excrement-smearing madman. The episode attacks the film, the controversy, the anti-Semitism, the cultural moment, and Gibson himself, all simultaneously. And it does so with a confidence that the actual participants in the controversy, the critics, the defenders, the church leaders, and the pundits, could not muster. Kenneth Jacobson of the Anti-Defamation League watched the episode and approved, noting that it was classic South Park and that everyone was a target. 2 years later, when Gibson was arrested for drunk driving and made anti-Semitic remarks to the arresting officers, the episode's portrayal of him as unhinged looked less like satire and more like prophecy. The same season brought Douche and Turd, the 8th episode, which aired on October 27th, 2004, 1 week before the presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. The episode involves a school election in which the two candidates for a new school mascot are a giant douche and a turd sandwich. Stan, seeing no meaningful difference between the options, refuses to vote and is banished from South Park. The episode's position that both candidates in the 2004 election were equally unappealing, and that the act of choosing between them was itself a form of degradation, was controversial, not because of its vulgarity, but because of its politics. Critics accused Parker and Stone of promoting apathy and voter disengagement, of telling their audience that democracy was pointless and participation was for suckers. Parker and Stone responded by pointing out that the episode ends with Stan voting, that the moral of the story is not that voting is pointless, but that every election feels like a choice between a douche and a turd, and you have to vote anyway. The douche and turd framework returned in the 20th season during the 2016 election, with Mr. Garrison standing in for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton standing in for herself, and the metaphor proved, if anything, more apt the second time around. The 8th season closed with Woodland Critter Christmas, which aired on December 15th, 2004, and which remains one of the most deliberately transgressive Christmas specials ever broadcast on American television. The episode begins in the style of a gentle holiday fable, narrated in rhyming verse, in which Stan discovers a group of adorable woodland animals building a Christmas tree. They are sweet, innocent, and grateful for Stan's help. They speak in high-pitched voices. They have names like Squirrely, Berry, and Rabbity. And then, with a tonal shift so abrupt, it functions as a kind of narrative assault. They are revealed to be Satanists. They sacrifice Rabbity the rabbit, devour his flesh, and hold an orgy in his blood. The remainder of the episode involves their attempt to bring about the birth of the Antichrist, a plot that involves Kyle being placed on a satanic altar and eventually accepting the Antichrist into his body, declaring that he will conquer the world in the name of the Jews. The episode's final reveal is that the entire story has been a school assignment written by Cartman, which explains both the anti-Semitic content and the increasingly unhinged narrative escalation. Mr. Garrison, fearing complaints from Kyle's mother, forces Cartman to stop reading. The episode operates on multiple levels simultaneously, functioning as a parody of holiday specials, a commentary on narrative manipulation, a satire of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and a showcase for Cartman's pathological creativity. The episode was inspired, according to Parker, by the 1997 science fiction horror film Event Horizon, and it shares that film's interest in the way that gentle surfaces can conceal extreme violence. The gap between the episode's aesthetic, all snow and rhyming couplets and cute animals, and its content, all blood sacrifice and demonic possession and anti-Semitic fantasy, is the joke. And the joke is that the gap itself is the most dangerous thing in the episode, because it mimics the way that real hatred operates, wrapping itself in the language of innocence and presenting itself as harmless until the moment it is not. The year 2005 also brought Best Friends Forever, which aired on March 30th, 2005, just hours before Terry Schiavo died. The Schiavo case had consumed American public life for months. A Florida woman in a persistent vegetative state since 1990 had become the center of a legal battle between her husband, who wanted her feeding tube removed, and her parents, who wanted it maintained. Congress had intervened. The president had signed emergency legislation. The case had become a proxy war for every cultural division in American politics, from the role of government to the sanctity of life to the right to die. South Park's response was to mirror the entire controversy through the character of Kenny, who dies, is left in a vegetative state, and becomes the subject of a nearly identical legal and media circus. Cartman petitions the court to remove Kenny's feeding tube, not out of compassion, but because he wants to inherit Kenny's PSP gaming console. The episode won the 2005 Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. And its central argument, delivered through the discovery of a missing page from Kenny's will, is that both sides of the Scavo debate were guilty of the same fundamental error, which was turning a private family tragedy into public political theater. The episode does not take a position on whether the feeding tube should have been removed. It takes a position on the spectacle, and the position is that the spectacle itself was the violation, regardless of which side was performing it. The timing of the episode's broadcast, coinciding almost exactly with Scavo's death, was unplanned, but gave the episode an immediacy that no amount of deliberate scheduling could have achieved. In November 2005, the 9th season brought Ginger Kids, an episode in which Cartman delivers a class presentation arguing that people with red hair, freckles, and pale skin suffer from a disease called gingivitis that makes them disgusting, inhuman, unable to survive in sunlight, and without souls. The episode is a satire of bigotry, structured as a parable about how prejudice operates. Its resolution involves Cartman being pranked into believing he has become a ginger himself, at which point he immediately reverses his position and begins advocating for ginger rights with the same self-righteous intensity he previously brought to ginger persecution. The message is not subtle. Prejudice is not about the target. It is about the person doing the targeting. The bigot does not hate gingers because gingers are worthy of hatred. The bigot hates gingers because the bigot needs something to hate, and gingers are convenient. Replace gingers with any other group, and the dynamic is identical. The message is clear, and the episode delivers it with characteristic bluntness. But the message did not prevent the episode from having real-world consequences that its creators could not have anticipated, and almost certainly would not have endorsed. In 2008, 3 years after Ginger Kids aired, a Facebook event titled National Kick a Ginger Day appeared, with a target date of November 20th. On that date, students with red hair were physically assaulted by classmates in schools across Canada and the United States. The incidents were not trivial. A spokeswoman for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police classified one incident as a hate crime. Similar events occurred in 2013 at Wingfield Academy in Rotherham, Yorkshire, where red-headed students faced organized discrimination, and again in 2015 in Massachusetts, where students with red hair were injured badly enough to bleed. The connection between the episode and the violence was debated, but singer Ed Sheeran was unequivocal. In multiple interviews over multiple years, he stated that the episode ruined his life, explaining that he had moved to America where people initially liked his red hair, but after the episode aired, the attitude shifted permanently and globally. Sheeran later clarified that he bore no personal grudge against the show, and even said he would love to voice a character someday. But the Ginger Kids episode remains one of the clearest and most troubling examples of a South Park controversy that escaped the screen and entered the physical world, causing harm that the creators neither intended nor could control. The gap between satirical intent and real-world impact is the gap in which most of the genuine harm in South Park's history has occurred, and it is a gap that no amount of brilliance in the writing room can fully close. The Ginger Kids episode also raises a question that recurs throughout South Park's history and that has no satisfying answer, which is the question of responsibility. Parker and Stone did not tell anyone to kick a red-haired child. They did not create the Facebook event. They did not organize the assaults. They made a satirical episode about the absurdity of prejudice, and some portion of their audience extracted from that episode not the intended message, which was that prejudice is irrational, but the surface content, which was that gingers are different, and that difference is funny. The extraction was a misreading, but it was a predictable misreading, and the question of whether the creators bear responsibility for predictable misreadings of their work is one that South Park's entire existence forces into the open. The show's position, stated and restated across decades, is that satire requires the freedom to be misread, that the alternative, crafting every joke so carefully that no one could possibly misinterpret it, would produce not satire, but safety, and that safety is the enemy of everything the show exists to do. The position is defensible. It is also incomplete, because the kicked children did not choose to participate in a debate about the limits of satire. They were simply children with the wrong color hair, standing in a schoolyard when someone who had watched a cartoon decided to hit them. The gap between the show and the schoolyard is the gap in which the argument lives, and neither side of it has found a way to close it. The same month that Ginger Kids aired, November 2005, South Park broadcast what may be its most consequential single episode in terms of its impact on the entertainment industry and the institutional power structures that govern it. Trapped in the Closet, the 12th episode of the 9th season, aired on November 16th, 2005, and it detonated like a controlled demolition in the foundation of a building that had been standing, unchallenged, for decades. The building, in this case, was the Church of Scientology, and the demolition was so thorough that its effects are still visible 20 years later. The premise involves Stan joining Scientology and, after scoring unusually high on a personality test, being declared the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the church's founder. The episode then presents the core beliefs of Scientology, specifically the story of Xenu, the galactic overlord who brought billions of frozen beings to Earth 75 million years ago aboard spacecraft resembling Douglas DC-8 airplanes, stacked them around volcanoes, and killed them with hydrogen bombs, releasing their souls, called thetans, which then attach themselves to the bodies of the living. As this story plays out on screen, animated in the show's crude cutout style, with the same flat affect used for everything else in the series, a text crawl runs along the bottom of the image. The text reads, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." The text does not blink. It does not waver. It sits there, plain and persistent, daring the viewer to disbelieve it. The episode also features Tom Cruise literally refusing to come out of Stan's closet, and it ends with Stan challenging the Church of Scientology to sue him. The fallout was immediate, sustained, and multi-directional. The day after the episode aired, on November 17th, 2005, Mike Rinder, a senior Scientology executive, wrote a memo to church leader David Miscavige. The memo noted that the show had not contacted the church or given any forewarning, that Isaac Hayes had not been informed, and that the program was a total mockery of Scientology, Tom Cruise, and John Travolta, and that it contained upper-level data, meaning the Xenu story, which Scientology reserves for members who have reached advanced levels. Reports emerged that Tom Cruise had threatened to withdraw from promoting Mission Impossible 3, which was being released by Paramount Pictures, a company owned by Viacom, which also owned Comedy Central. A scheduled rebroadcast of the episode on March 15th, 2006, was pulled from the schedule and replaced with a different episode. Parker and Stone responded with a mock press release that thanked the Church of Scientology for its sense of humor and expressed their hope that the organization would continue to be a source of laughter for years to come. The credits of the Trapped in the Closet episode contained their own quiet act of defiance. Every person involved in the production of the episode, every animator, every writer, every editor, every sound technician, was credited as either John Smith or Jane Smith, including the show's world-famous creators. The gesture was partly humorous, partly a parody of the kind of anonymity that people associate with witness protection, but it was also partly practical. The Church of Scientology had a well-documented history of investigating, surveilling, and harassing its critics. A leaked internal memo from 2005 confirmed that the church had been considering how to respond to the episode and how to manage the damage. Parker and Stone were protecting their staff by refusing to provide real names. The fact that a television production team felt the need to hide its identity from a religious organization on American soil in the 21st century is a detail that tends to get buried under the larger narrative of the controversy, but it is perhaps the most telling detail of all, because it reveals the specific kind of power that the Church of Scientology wielded, a power not of persuasion, but of intimidation, and it reveals that Parker and Stone, for all their bravado, took that power seriously enough to shield their employees from it. But the most significant casualty of the Trapped in the Closet fallout was Isaac Hayes, the legendary soul musician who had voiced the character Chef since the show's first episode. Hayes was a practicing Scientologist, and after the episode aired, he publicly quit the show, issuing a statement criticizing South Park for what he called its intolerance and bigotry in disparaging religions. Matt Stone responded with characteristic directness. He pointed out that Hayes had been perfectly content to collect his paycheck while the show mocked Christians, Jews, Muslims, and every other religious group on Earth, and that his objection only arose when his own religion was targeted. The statement was blunt, and it drew a sharp, uncomfortable line between the show's principle of equal opportunity offense and the selective outrage of those who only object when the satire hits close to home. The show's response to Hayes' departure was the first episode of the 10th season, The Return of Chef, which aired on March 22, 2006, and which drew more than 3.5 million viewers, making it Comedy Central's highest-rated season premiere in 4 years. In the episode, Chef returns to South Park after joining the Super Adventure Club, a fictional organization modeled on Scientology. He has been brainwashed and speaks in dialogue cobbled together from audio clips of Hayes' previous performances, creating a halting, Frankenstein-like quality that is simultaneously funny and disturbing. Chef is eventually killed in a sequence that is grotesquely violent even by South Park standards. The episode is a farewell, a eulogy, and an accusation all at once, and it draws its power from the genuine affection that Parker and Stone had for Hayes, an affection that coexists, without contradiction, with their fury at the institution they believed had taken him from them. The full story of Isaac Hayes' departure would not emerge for years. After Hayes died on August 10, 2008, his son, Isaac Hayes III, revealed a version of events that was far more troubling than anything that had been publicly understood. According to Hayes III, his father had suffered a stroke in January 2006, shortly after the Trapped in the Closet episode aired. The stroke left him unable to speak clearly or make decisions on his own. He was in no condition to resign from anything. He had to relearn to play the piano. He had to relearn basic cognitive functions. Hayes III stated plainly that his father did not quit South Park, that Scientology quit for him. According to The Sun, everyone around Isaac Hayes at the time, his assistants, his managers, his inner circle, were Scientologists, and one of them issued the resignation statement on his behalf without his knowledge or consent. Hayes III said his father loved being the voice of Chef and greatly enjoyed meeting fans of the show. The revelation reframed the entire controversy. It was no longer a story about a man standing up for his beliefs against a show that had crossed a line. It was a story about a vulnerable man being manipulated by the very institution that South Park had been trying to expose, which was, in a way, exactly the kind of story South Park had been telling about Scientology all along. The show had argued that the church controls its members. The church then demonstrated that argument by controlling one of the show's own cast members. The proof was in the act itself. Before we move on, if you have not subscribed yet, it really does make a difference. It is free, and it means we can keep making these long videos for you. The same month that The Return of Chef aired, South Park also broadcast Bloody Mary, the 9th season finale, which had aired on December 7th, 2005, and which generated its own distinct category of outrage. The episode's plot involves Randy Marsh losing his driver's license for driving under the influence and attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, where he becomes convinced that alcoholism is a fatal, incurable disease. Meanwhile, a statue of the Virgin Mary begins bleeding, and Randy believes that being bled upon will cure his alcoholism. The episode's climax involves Pope Benedict XVI examining the statue and discovering that the blood is not coming from the statue's rear, as originally reported, but from another anatomical location, at which point the Pope declares the phenomenon unremarkable and leaves. The episode had aired on the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a Catholic observance specifically related to the Virgin Mary, and whether the timing was intentional or coincidental, it amplified the outrage considerably. The Catholic League, led by President William Donahue, demanded an immediate apology and insisted that the episode be permanently retired from syndication and never released on DVD. The organization pressured Joseph A. Califano Jr., a Viacom board member and practicing Catholic, to issue a personal statement. Califano complied, calling the episode an appalling and disgusting portrayal of the Virgin Mary and pledging to have it reviewed. When Comedy Central subsequently reran the entire 9th season in late 2005 and early 2006, Bloody Mary was conspicuously absent from the broadcast schedule. The controversy spread internationally. In New Zealand, Catholic bishops lobbied the media conglomerate Kanye West to prevent the episode from airing on the C4 network. The bishops called for a boycott of C4 and its sister network, TV3. Kanye West's response was to air the episode sooner than originally planned, reasoning that the controversy had generated so much media attention that the audience for the episode had already been created, and that suppressing it would only increase demand. The decision was pragmatic rather than principled, but its effect was the same. The episode aired. The boycott fizzled, and the Bloody Mary episode took its place in the South Park catalog as another data point in the show's ongoing experiment in the limits of public tolerance. In October 2006, South Park demonstrated that no subject was too raw, no wound too fresh, and no timeline too short for the show's particular form of engagement. The episode Hell on Earth 2006, the 11th episode of the 10th season, aired on October 25th, 2006, 7 weeks after the death of Steve Irwin, the Australian wildlife expert killed by a stingray barb on September 4th, 2006. In the episode, Satan throws a lavish Halloween party in hell. One of the guests is Steve Irwin, who arrives with a stingray protruding from his chest. Satan initially mistakes him for a partygoer in a costume and tells him the costume is in bad taste, that it is too soon to be dressing as Steve Irwin after his death. The joke is layered. It is not simply that Steve Irwin is dead and at a party in hell. It is that even Satan, the embodiment of evil, recognizes that the costume is inappropriate. The show is acknowledging the bad taste of its own joke through a character who is supposed to be beyond moral judgment, and the acknowledgement does not soften the joke. It sharpens it. A friend of Terry Irwin, Steve's widow, issued a statement saying that Terry was devastated by the depiction and worried that their children, Bindi and Bob, would see it and break down. John Byer, the director of Media Watch UK, called it tasteless. Fellow naturalist Mark Amy used stronger language. Comedy Central's spokesperson defended the episode with a statement that has become a kind of company motto. The South Park guys do inappropriate things all the time. Their goal is to make people laugh, not to offend people. Parker and Stone themselves expressed genuine surprise at the level of backlash, pointing out that the show had featured far more offensive material in its history. The disconnect between the creator's internal calibration of offense and the public's is a recurring feature of South Park scandals, and it is worth pausing on because it explains much about why the show generates the reactions it does. Parker and Stone do not operate on the same scale of sensitivity as their audience. They have spent so long inside the world of the show, a world where everything is a potential target and nothing is sacred, that they have lost, or perhaps never possessed, the instinct that tells most people when a subject is too raw to touch. They are not being callous. They are being consistent. And consistency, when applied to grief, can look very much like cruelty. The Steve Irwin depiction also raises a question about the relationship between time and taste that South Park has confronted repeatedly throughout. There is something uniquely cruel about a cliffhanger. It is a promise, really. A silent contract between a show and its audience that says, we know you are invested, and we will honor that investment. When the first season of South Park ended on February 25th, 1998, with an episode called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut. It closed on one of the most talked about cliffhangers in animated television history. Who is Cartman's father? That was the question. Dr. Mephisto had run the DNA test. The results were in, and then the screen went black. Come back in 4 weeks, the show promised. Season 2 will give you the answer. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to remember what South Park was in 1998. It was not yet a cultural institution. It was still the new thing, the dangerous thing, the show that parents were worried about and teenagers were obsessed with. It had only been on the air for 1 season, 13 episodes, and it had already become the highest rated series in Comedy Central's history. The merchandise was everywhere. The catchphrases had entered the language, and the first season finale, with its lurid title and its unresolved mystery, had given the audience something that animated comedies rarely offered at the time, a genuine reason to come back that went beyond habit. People wanted to know who Cartman's father was. They cared about it in a way that surprised even the show's creators. Fans marked their calendars. The internet, still young and chaotic and beautiful in that late 90s way, buzzed with theories. Comedy Central hyped the premiere relentlessly. The network understood that this was an event, appointment television in an era when that phrase still meant something concrete, when millions of people arranged their Wednesday nights around a single half hour of programming. And then April 1st, 1998 arrived. The season 2 premiere aired, and it was not the episode anyone expected. Instead of resolving the cliffhanger, Trey Parker and Matt Stone delivered an episode called Terrence and Philip in Not Without My Anus. There was no Cartman, no DNA test, no reveal, no acknowledgement whatsoever that the cliffhanger had ever existed. The entire episode followed Terrence and Philip, the flatulence-obsessed Canadian duo, as they attempted to stop Saddam Hussein from taking over Canada. It was a full-length Terrence and Philip episode, the show within the show that had always been South Park's way of mocking lowbrow entertainment. It was, in every conceivable way, an April Fool's prank, and not a gentle one. The reaction was immediate and volcanic. Comedy Central was flooded with phone calls from the moment the episode ended. The switchboard lit up in ways that the network had never experienced before. Within a single week, the network received over 2,000 angry emails from viewers who felt personally betrayed. 2,000 emails in 1998, when sending an email to a television network required actually finding the address, opening a browser, navigating to a mail client, and composing a message fueled by genuine indignation. Every single one of those 2,000 people was angry enough to go through that process. Diane Wirtz of Newsday would later write that fans rioted, and that some of them jumped ship and never came back. That phrase, never came back, carries more weight than it might seem. It means that a comedy show about construction paper characters lost actual viewers permanently over a practical joke. The betrayal ran that deep. The fury was not just about the episode itself, which was a perfectly functional Terrence and Philip adventure, complete with the fart jokes and Canadian stereotypes that the show within a show had always provided. It was about the principle of the thing. People had waited. They had been patient. They had endured 5 weeks of anticipation. 5 weeks of the network telling them that the answer was coming, and the show had laughed at them for caring. It had taken their investment and used it as the setup for a joke at their expense. The punchline was their own disappointment. It was a joke that only worked if people cared, which meant it was simultaneously a compliment and an insult. You had to be invested for the prank to land. And landing it did, with the force of 2,000 angry emails and a switchboard that would not stop ringing. What made the situation even more excruciating was the timeline. Viewers would not get the actual answer for another 3 weeks. The follow-up episode, Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, did not air until April 22nd. That is nearly 2 months after the original cliffhanger. 2 months of wondering about a construction paper child's parentage. 2 months of knowing that the answer existed, that the creators had it, and that they were deliberately withholding it because they thought the withholding itself was funnier than anything the answer could provide. The cruelty was the point. The waiting was the content. Matt Stone, in a now famous response to Entertainment Weekly, offered no apology. His position was blunt. If you get that pissed off because you do not know who a little construction paper kid's father is, then there is really something wrong with you. It was a quintessentially South Park response. Unapologetic, confrontational, and honestly, kind of fair. But it also revealed something important about the relationship between the show and its audience. Parker and Stone were never going to play by the rules of conventional television. They were never going to treat their viewers with the careful, market-tested deference that other shows employed. They respected their audience enough to prank them, which is a strange kind of respect, but a genuine one. It assumes the audience is smart enough to eventually get the joke, even when the joke is on them. And when the answer finally did come, it was almost anticlimactic by design. The episode revealed that Cartman's mother was a hermaphrodite, and therefore also his father. It was a punchline masquerading as a resolution, a deliberate letdown that confirmed what the April Fool's prank had already suggested, that the question was always more interesting than any answer could be. Years later, even that answer would be retconned. Season 14 would reveal that Jack Tennerman was Cartman's real father, a twist made horrifying by the fact that Cartman had already unknowingly orchestrated Jack's death in the legendary Scott Tenorman Must Die. The mystery of Cartman's father became a thread that the show would pull on for over a decade, each tug unraveling something darker than the last. The prank was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something that would take 12 years to fully resolve. And when it did resolve, it resolved into horror. The April Fool's prank of 1998 was not just a scandal. It was a statement of intent. South Park would always prioritize its own creative instincts over audience expectations. Media outlets reported that some fans held a grudge against the show for more than 5 years after the episode aired. 5 years over a cartoon. And yet the show survived. More than survived, really. It thrived. Because the same reckless energy that produced the prank also produced everything that made South Park worth watching in the first place. The willingness to risk alienating every single viewer in pursuit of a joke is not a weakness. It is the show's defining characteristic. And it started here, on April Fool's Day, 1998, when 2 guys in their late 20s decided that making their audience angry was more interesting than making them happy. And speaking of moments that pushed boundaries further than anyone expected, there is one season premiere that nearly ended South Park before its 9th year even began. When South Park returned for its 9th season on March 9th, 2005, it opened with an episode that tested the limits of what could air on basic cable in ways that went far beyond the show's usual provocations. Mr. Garrison's Fancy New Vagina is not an episode about shock value for its own sake, though it certainly contains plenty of shock value. It is an episode about identity, about the gap between who we believe ourselves to be and who we actually are, and about the absurd lengths people will go to in order to close that gap. It is also an episode that nearly destroyed its own creator. The premise is straightforward enough by South Park standards. Mr. Garrison, the perpetually confused and deeply repressed elementary school teacher, decides to undergo sex reassignment surgery. This is not Garrison's first identity crisis. Over the course of the show, Garrison has cycled through personas with a frequency that suggests less a journey of self-discovery and more a fundamental inability to sit still inside his own skin. But this time, the transformation is physical. He travels to the Trinidad Medical Center, where a Dr. Biber performs a vaginoplasty. The character is based on a real person, Dr. Stanley Biber, a surgeon in Trinidad, Colorado, who was widely known as the pioneer of sex reassignment surgery in the United States, and who had performed thousands of such procedures over the course of his career. Garrison emerges as Janet Garrison, a woman, at least in the physical sense. The name change is immediate. The identity shift is total. But the episode does not stop there. It escalates. Inspired by Garrison's transformation, Kyle decides he wants to become tall and black so he can play basketball. His mother Sheila, in attempting to explain sex reassignment surgery, inadvertently implies that any mismatch between self-image and physical reality can be resolved through surgical intervention. Kyle takes this literally. He undergoes what the show calls a negroplasty. Kyle's father Gerald, meanwhile, is convinced by the same surgeon to undergo a dolphinoplasty, surgically altering his appearance to resemble a dolphin, complete with a dorsal fin fashioned from tissue that previously belonged to Garrison. Each storyline is more absurd than the last, building on the premise that if one form of physical transformation is valid, then all forms must be equally valid. It is a reductio ad absurdum, a logical framework that the show uses to push its satire to genuinely uncomfortable extremes. The climax brings all three storylines together in a scene of spectacular grotesquerie. Garrison's former testicles have been transplanted into Kyle's knees to make him taller. His former scrotum has been fashioned into Gerald's dorsal fin. At the all-state basketball game, Kyle goes up for a dunk, and when he lands, his new kneecaps explode. The scene covers everyone in biological material that does not bear detailed description. It is, in its own deranged way, a commentary on the consequences of treating the human body as infinitely malleable, as raw material to be sculpted into whatever shape desire demands. But the controversy surrounding the episode had less to do with its satirical targets and more to do with what viewers actually saw on screen. The original cut of the episode contained over 5 minutes of real sex reassignment surgery footage. Not animated, not stylized. Actual medical footage of an actual procedure, spliced into a cartoon about construction paper characters. Parker and Stone had included it because, by their own admission, they had run out of ideas for how to depict the surgery in animation. The footage was graphic in a way that no South Park episode had ever been graphic before. This was not cartoon violence. This was clinical reality. Comedy Central intervened. The network could not air 5 minutes of genuine surgical footage on a comedy channel at 10 o'clock at night. The surgery footage was trimmed to 3 brief shots, each lasting roughly 1 second. It was still jarring, still unlike anything that had ever aired on the network. These split-second flashes of actual medical procedure interrupting an animated comedy, but it was at least brief enough to avoid triggering a full-scale regulatory crisis. The behind-the-scenes story is almost as dramatic as the episode itself. Trey Parker has stated publicly that in the days leading up to the air date, he nearly quit. He described the experience as almost pulling a Dave Chappelle, a reference to comedian Dave Chappelle's abrupt departure from his own Comedy Central show earlier that same year. Chappelle had famously walked away from a $50 million deal because the creative pressure had become unbearable. Parker, it seems, came close to doing the same thing. The stress of producing the episode, of navigating the creative and institutional pressures, of fighting with the network over surgery footage, while simultaneously trying to make a coherent piece of television, brought Parker closer to walking away from South Park than perhaps any other moment in the show's history. And then there is the question of legacy. Parker and Stone themselves have acknowledged discomfort with how the episode aged. They have admitted that the episode came across as more transphobic than they had intended. The satirical framework, the idea that Kyle wanting to be black and Gerald wanting to be a dolphin are equivalent to Garrison wanting to be a woman, implies that all three desires are equally absurd. In 2005, that framework was provocative, but within the bounds of mainstream comedy. In the years since, as the cultural conversation around transgender identity has deepened and evolved, the equivalence has come to feel less like satire and more like dismissal. Critics have been less forgiving. IndieWire, in a 2019 retrospective, described the episode as a landmine of insensitive assumptions about transgender people, arguing that it perpetuates stereotypes about transitions being motivated by superficial desires rather than genuine psychological necessity. The episode sits in an uncomfortable space within the South Park catalog. It is not unwatchable. The absurdist escalation has a certain deranged internal logic that is, on a purely structural level, impressive in its commitment, but it is also a product of its time in ways that the show's creators seem to recognize and perhaps even regret. The fact that Parker nearly abandoned the entire series over this episode suggests that even by South Park's own elastic standards, this one pushed too far. Not necessarily because of the controversy it generated, but because of what it cost the people who made it. But not every scandal involves outrage. Sometimes the most remarkable thing a show can do is take a form that no one thought belonged on television and turn it into something that wins awards. On October 4th, 2006, South Park aired the 8th episode of its 10th season, and in doing so, accomplished something that should not have been possible. Make Love, Not Warcraft is an episode about 4 boys playing a video game. That is it. That is the premise. Cartman, Kyle, Stan, and Kenny are playing World of Warcraft, the massively multiplayer online role-playing game that had, by 2006, become one of the most culturally significant pieces of entertainment software ever created. At its peak, World of Warcraft had over 12 million active subscribers, each paying a monthly fee to inhabit a shared fantasy world of orcs and elves and dragons and endless grinding repetition. It was not just a game. It was a second life for millions of people. And South Park somehow understood that. The plot is deceptively simple. A rogue player is going around killing other players indiscriminately, ruining the experience for everyone. He camps at spawn points and slaughters new players before they can even take their first steps in the world. The Blizzard executives within the game world are powerless to stop him. He has become too powerful, having played for so long and accumulated so much experience that even the game's administrators cannot intervene. He exists outside the rules. The boys decide to stop him. They do this not through cleverness or strategy or some heroic quest handed down by a wise mentor figure. They do it through sheer, grinding, soul-crushing repetition. They kill boars, thousands of boars, day after day, week after week. They play the game for so long that their bodies begin to deteriorate. They get fat. They develop acne. They stop bathing. They stop going outside. Their posture collapses into the hunched, forward-leaning stance of people who have not looked away from a screen in weeks. They become, in other words, the very stereotype that the gaming community had spent years trying to escape. And yet, the episode never condescends. It never looks down on them. It understands that the grinding is, in its own way, heroic, pointless, destructive, physically ruinous, socially devastating, and heroic because they are doing it for a reason. They are doing it to protect something they love. What made the episode remarkable was not just its writing, which is some of the sharpest in the show's history, but its production. Parker and Stone collaborated directly with Blizzard Entertainment, the company behind World of Warcraft, to create the in-game footage used throughout the episode. This was unprecedented. A major gaming company was handing over its intellectual property, its character models, its unreleased software, to a show that had built its entire reputation on mockery and irreverence. Blizzard provided character models and access to their own computers for testing. They gave the South Park production team permission to use the alpha server of the then unreleased expansion pack World of Warcraft, The Burning Crusade, a version of the game that had not yet been released to the public. The fact that they allowed South Park to shoot on pre-release software suggests a level of trust and creative partnership that goes beyond anything a standard corporate licensing agreement would provide. The machinima, a term for animation created using video game engines, was produced over 5 shooting days. The first session took place on September 20th, lasting approximately 3 to 5 hours. The last session was October 3rd, 2006, the day before the episode aired. That last last detail deserves emphasis. The final footage was completed the day before broadcast. The production timeline for the World of Warcraft segments was 3 full weeks, compared to the 6 days that a normal South Park episode requires. The team had to learn entirely new tools, coordinate with an external company, and integrate 2 completely different animation styles: the show's traditional 2-dimensional cutout aesthetic and the 3-dimensional rendered world of Warcraft into a single coherent narrative. They pulled it off with 1 day to spare. Parker and Stone later said they were completely shocked that Blizzard agreed to participate. There was no obvious reason for a major gaming company to hand over its intellectual property to a show that was, by its nature, going to mock everything it touched. But Blizzard understood something that many corporations do not. Being mocked by South Park is not the same as being attacked by South Park. The episode treats World of Warcraft with genuine affection. It understands why people play. It understands the appeal, the addiction, the strange sense of community that emerges from spending hundreds of hours in a virtual world with strangers who become friends. It also understands how absurd all of that looks from the outside, how inexplicable it is to anyone who has never felt the pull of a world that does not physically exist. The mockery and the affection are not contradictory. They are the same thing. The result was an episode that drew 3.4 million viewers on its original broadcast, most of them in the coveted 18 to 49 demographic. That number made it Comedy Central's highest-rated mid-season premiere since the year 2000. The audience was not just large, it bridged communities. Gamers who had never watched South Park tuned in because they had heard about the Blizzard collaboration. South Park fans who had never played World of Warcraft watched because they trusted the show to make it interesting. The episode gave both audiences something to love, and then came the Emmy. In 2007, Make Love Not Warcraft won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program for programming less than 1 hour. It was the first time a piece of machinima had been recognized by the Television Academy. Animation created inside a video game engine, using assets borrowed from a fantasy role-playing game, integrated into a show made with construction paper cutouts by 2 guys from Colorado, won the same award that had previously gone to The Simpsons. It was a legitimization not just of South Park, but of an entire art form that had, until that moment, existed entirely on the margins of entertainment. The cultural impact extended far beyond the award. Make Love Not Warcraft became one of the most referenced and rewatched episodes in South Park's history. It has been named the best video game episode in television history by multiple outlets. It spawned memes that persist to this day. The image of Cartman, bloated and pale, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a computer screen, surrounded by empty snack bags and energy drink cans, one hand on the mouse and the other reaching for something to eat without ever looking away from the screen, is one of the most iconic images in the history of animated television. It is funny, it is sad, it is uncomfortably recognizable to anyone who has ever lost themselves in a game for longer than they intended, and it won an Emmy. Sometimes the best thing a scandal can be is proof that the people who said it could not be done were wrong. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this rearesis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Now, here is something most people miss entirely. Sometimes the most unsettling thing South Park can do is not mock the world around it, but turn inward and ask whether it still has anything left to say. On June 8th, 2011, South Park aired the 7th episode of its 15th season, and for the first time in the show's history, a significant portion of the audience genuinely believed they were watching a series finale. You're Getting Old is not a typical episode of South Park. There is no clear villain. There is no satirical target ripped from the headlines. There is no moment of catharsis where the boys learn a lesson or the town returns to normal. There is instead something much harder to categorize, something quiet, something that felt, to many viewers, like a goodbye. Stan Marsh turns 10 years old, and after his birthday, something changes. He starts hearing all music as the literal sound of feces. Television shows look like feces. Movies look like feces. The things his friends enjoy, the cultural products that once gave him pleasure, all of them now register as, in the show's blunt terminology, shit. His friends notice. They pull away. Kyle, who has been Stan's best friend for the entire run of the series, begins to distance himself. Stan's enthusiasm has been replaced by a relentless, corrosive corrosive skepticism that makes him unpleasant to be around. He is not being difficult. He is not choosing to be negative. Something has genuinely broken inside him. Some mechanism that filtered the world into categories of enjoyable and not enjoyable has simply stopped functioning. He has crossed an invisible threshold, and the world on the other side is uglier than the one he left behind. The show treats this not as a joke, but as a genuine affliction. A doctor tells Stan he has become a cynical asshole, and the diagnosis is delivered with the solemnity of a medical condition. Because that is what the episode is really about. Not cynicism as a personality trait or a lifestyle choice. Cynicism as a disease. An inability to find joy in the things that once provided it. A growing, metastasizing suspicion that everything is manufactured. That everything is trying to sell you something. That the only honest response to a dishonest world is contempt. It is a condition that anyone who has ever created anything for a long time will recognize. The early love fades. The excitement curdles. The thing you built your life around starts looking like everything you built it to escape from. The first element of the storyline to be developed was Stan's birthday and his dawning awareness that he is getting old. This was not arbitrary. At the time of the episode's broadcast, Matt Stone had just turned 40 and Trey Parker was 41. They had been making South Park for 14 years. They had written and produced over 200 episodes. They had spent their entire adult lives inside a show that demanded every single week that they find something new to say about the world. The parallel between Stan's existential crisis and the creator's own fatigue was impossible to miss. Parker would later describe the period as one of intense self-questioning. How long can you keep doing this? He asked. It was a question directed at himself as much as anyone else. How long can you sit down at the desk and find the thing that makes it worth doing? How long before the thing you love starts looking like everything else? And then came the ending. As Fleetwood Mac's Landslide plays, the episode delivers a montage that would have been unthinkable in any previous season. Sharon and Randy Marsh separate. They sell their house. Stan, Sharon, and Shelley move to a new home across town. Stan sits alone in his new room, surrounded by unpacked boxes, listening to music that sounds like garbage, staring at a world that has lost all color. Across town, Randy sits alone in the empty house they used to share. The furniture is gone. The walls are bare. The family is broken. The status quo, the one constant that South Park had maintained across 15 seasons, is destroyed. The dialogue between Sharon and Randy that drove this sequence was not scripted until less than 48 hours before the episode aired. It was one of the last elements completed. The emotional core of the episode, the part that made people cry, was written in a state of exhaustion by two men who were themselves questioning whether they had anything left to give. The writing was not polished. It was raw, and that rawness is what made it land. The episode drew 2.3 million viewers and generated immediate speculation that the show was over. Critics and fans alike interpreted the episode as a thinly veiled farewell. Online forums filled with posts rearising every moment for evidence that this was the end. The use of Landslide, a song about the passage of time and the inevitability of change, felt deliberately funereal. It was the only song in the episode that was not accompanied by the sound of defecation, which gave it an almost sacred quality within the episode's internal logic. Everything else sounded like shit, but Landslide sounded like landslide. It was real, and its realness, in the context of an episode about the inability to tell what is real anymore, was shattering. When South Park returned 4 months later with Asperger's, the fall premiere of season 15, it continued Stan's storyline. He is still cynical. His parents are still separated. His friends have moved on. He drifts through school like a ghost. And then he discovers something. Drinking alcohol temporarily restores his ability to enjoy things. A sip of whiskey, and suddenly music sounds like music again. The world regains its color. It is one of the darkest observations the show has ever made. It is dark because it is not really a joke. It is an observation about self-medication, about the way people numb themselves in order to function in a world that has become unbearable, about the quiet desperation of reaching for the one thing that brings the color back, even though you know it is killing you. The episode resolves Stan's crisis, but not neatly. By the end, the status quo is restored. Randy and Sharon are back together. Stan is back with his friends. Everything is fine, except it is not fine. The restoration feels hollow, forced. It feels like the show is putting its toys back in the box because that is what shows do, not because anyone believes the toys belong there. The final shot lingers on Stan, reaching for a bottle of whiskey hidden in his desk drawer. The cynicism has not been cured. It has been medicated. The color has come back, but the bottle is still there. And the question the bottle represents, whether any of this is worth it, whether the joy is real or just a side effect of something that will eventually destroy you, remains unanswered. Together, You're Getting Old and Ass Burgers form a two-part meditation on creative exhaustion, aging, and the question of whether any piece of art can sustain itself across decades without losing the thing that made it vital. It is the most personal thing Parker and Stone have ever put into the show. And for a brief, disorienting moment in the summer of 2011, millions of people genuinely believed that South Park was over. It was not. But the fact that the possibility felt real, that the show had earned enough emotional credibility to make its own death feel plausible, says something profound about what those 15 seasons had built. They had built something that people cared about losing. And sometimes, caring about losing something is the only way to know it mattered. But that is not even the strangest part, because more than a decade later, South Park would prove that it had lost none of its ability to make very specific, very powerful people very uncomfortable. On February 15th, 2023, South Park aired the second episode of its 26th season, and within hours, it was international news. Not because of a censorship battle, not because of a religious controversy, but because it made a prince and his wife very, very angry. The Worldwide Privacy Tour is, on its surface, a fairly standard South Park premise. The Prince of Canada and his wife arrive in the small Colorado town. They announce that they are seeking privacy and seclusion, that they want nothing more than to live quietly away from the public eye. They then proceed to do the exact opposite, inserting themselves into every aspect of the community, promoting a book, giving interviews, appearing on magazine covers, and generally making their desire for privacy the single loudest thing about them. The irony is structural. It is baked into every scene. Every time the prince says he wants to be left alone, he says it on camera. Every time his wife says she is tired of the spotlight, she says it into a microphone. The gap between what they claim to want and what they actually do is not a subplot. It is the entire episode. The targets were obvious. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle had spent the preceding months in a media blitz that included a 6-part Netflix docuseries, a bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey, and the publication of Harry's memoir, Spare, which became one of the fastest-selling nonfiction books in history. They had stepped back from their duties as senior members of the British royal family, moved to California, and embarked on what critics described as a campaign of simultaneous withdrawal and overexposure. The contradiction at the heart of their public persona, the insistence on privacy delivered through the most public channels imaginable, was exactly the kind of hypocrisy that South Park was built to dissect. It was a gift. The show did not have to exaggerate anything. It just had to describe what was already happening. The episode does not simply mock Harry and Meghan, though it certainly does that with characteristic precision. The Prince of Canada promotes his own book, titled Wah, an obvious parody of Spare that reduces the memoir to its emotional essence, a prolonged wail of grievance. He sets up a drum kit on a basketball court, where Kyle and his friends are trying to play, imposing himself on their space while insisting he does not want attention. He inserts himself into situations where he is neither wanted nor needed, all while maintaining that he just wants to be left alone. His wife, meanwhile, is depicted as obsessively managing her public brand, consulting with image experts, and interpreting any lack of attention as a personal attack. She exists in a state of perpetual grievance, convinced that the world owes her its attention, and that the withdrawal of that attention constitutes a form of violence against her. Kyle Broflovsky serves as the episode's moral center, which is fitting, because Kyle has always been the show's conscience, the character most likely to articulate what the episode is actually about beneath the jokes. Kyle is trying to improve his own life through brand management, a storyline that mirrors the Meghan character's obsession with image. His younger brother Ike keeps watching footage of the Queen of Canada's funeral, preventing Kyle from playing an online game with his friends. It is a small domestic frustration that becomes the entry point for a much larger story about how public grief and private inconvenience intersect in the age of constant media. But where Kyle eventually rejects the artificiality of personal branding, recognizing that reducing yourself to a product makes you less human, the prince's wife doubles down. When Kyle fails to react to her provocations, she accuses him of victimizing her through his indifference. Kyle eventually discovers that the wife is consulting with a branding manager to orchestrate retaliation against anyone who does not pay sufficient attention to her, and he delivers the episode's thesis that engineering one's public image reduces people to performers rather than human beings. The reaction from the real-world targets was swift and, in its own way, perfectly confirmed the episode's central argument. Reports emerged that the Duchess of Sussex was upset and overwhelmed by the episode, and that she refused to watch it in its entirety. A spokesperson for the couple denied rumors that Harry and Meghan were considering legal action against the show. The denial itself became a news story, because of course it did. Every response generated more coverage. Every statement of indifference proved the opposite of indifference. The episode had created a trap that its targets could not escape without proving its thesis correct. Ignoring it proved they were aware of it. Responding to it proved they cared about it. Threatening legal action would prove they could not take criticism. Denying they were threatening legal action proved the threat had been considered. There was no right move. The episode drew 556,000 linear viewers on Comedy Central for its initial broadcast, a modest number by historical standards, but one that does not account for streaming or the millions who watched clips online. The cultural conversation it generated was vastly disproportionate to its ratings. For days, the episode dominated social media. News outlets around the world covered it. The episode scored an 8.3 out of 10 on IMDb based on thousands of user votes. What made the worldwide privacy tour resonate was not its cruelty. South Park has been crueler. It was its precision. The episode identified the exact fault line in Harry and Meghan's public narrative and applied pressure with surgical accuracy. The desire for privacy is not inherently hypocritical. Plenty of public figures maintain genuine boundaries between their public and private lives. But the specific manner in which Harry and Meghan pursued their privacy through a Netflix deal, a Spotify deal, a memoir, and an Oprah interview created a contradiction so obvious that a show built on identifying contradictions could not resist it. And the fact that the targets responded exactly the way the episode predicted they would, with indignation, with the simultaneous insistence that they were above such petty attacks, while clearly being deeply affected by them, was perhaps the most South Park outcome imaginable. The show did not need to write a follow-up. Reality wrote it for them. And if you are enjoying this, a quick subscribe really does help. It is free, and it means we can keep making these long videos for you. Stay with me here, because this next part changes everything about how we think about South Park's role in the cultural conversation. On May 24th, 2024, South Park released its latest streaming special on Paramount+, and it tackled a subject that had become impossible to ignore. The end of obesity is about Ozempic. Or more precisely, it is about semaglutide, the class of drugs originally developed for type 2 diabetes that had, by 2024, become the most talked about weight loss phenomenon in the world. Celebrities were using it openly. Talk show hosts were joking about it. The before and after photos were flooding every social media platform. Red carpet appearances had become a game of spot the semaglutide, with entertainment journalists speculating about which newly slender celebrities owed their transformation to the drug rather than to diet and discipline. Semaglutide had become a cultural dividing line, separating those who could afford it from those who could not. Those who saw it as a medical breakthrough from those who saw it as a shortcut. Those who believed in body positivity from those who believed that body positivity had always been a consolation prize for people too poor for pharmaceutical intervention. The special opens with a scene that is, by South Park standards, remarkably restrained. A doctor informs Eric Cartman and his mother Leanne that his obesity is a genuine threat to his health. This is not played for laughs in the way Cartman's weight has always been played for laughs. It is played straight. Cartman is overweight. He has always been overweight. For 27 years, it has been one of the show's most reliable sources of humor. But here, the show pauses and asks what it would actually mean for a child to be told that his body is going to kill him. Leanne explains that proper diet and exercise have not worked. The doctor recommends semaglutide, but because Cartman does not have diabetes, his insurance will not cover the prescription. The cost without insurance is prohibitive, hundreds of dollars per month that a single mother cannot afford. And just like that, Cartman becomes a sympathetic figure. He is a child whose body is failing him, whose mother cannot afford the treatment that might help. and whose options have been reduced to either suffering or finding an alternative that does not exist. That alternative arrives in the form of a prescription for Lizzo. The doctor, unable to prescribe the drug that would actually help, tells Cartman to listen to Lizzo 5 times a day and watch her videos before bedtime. Body positivity as medication. Self-acceptance as a substitute for actual medical treatment. The joke is brutal in its clarity. It is not mocking Lizzo specifically, so much as it is mocking the system that offers her as a replacement for the drug it will not pay for. The body positivity movement, the special suggests, is not wrong in its principles. Loving yourself is fine. Accepting your body is fine. But telling people to love themselves instead of giving them access to a drug that could save their lives is not compassion. It is cost-cutting, dressed up as philosophy. The special's most quoted line distills the entire argument into a single sentence. Rich people get Ozempic, poor people get body positivity. It is the kind of observation that sounds like a punchline until you sit with it and realize it is also a fairly accurate description of how the American healthcare system functions. The wealthy have access to drugs that work. Everyone else gets told to love themselves. The line is not clever because it is funny. It is clever because it is true. Meanwhile, Randy Marsh discovers semaglutide through the local mothers in South Park, who have all attained toned midriffs and begun wearing crop tops. Randy starts taking the drug himself, treating it as a recreational substance, a party drug that leaves him with neither a hangover nor an appetite. His storyline serves as a parallel satire of the way semaglutide had been adopted by people who did not need it medically but wanted its cosmetic benefits, further restricting the already limited supply for people who needed it to survive. Randy does not care that his vanity is making the drug less available to people like Cartman. He does not even think about it. That is the point. The system does not require anyone to be evil. It does not require malice or deliberate cruelty. It just requires enough people to be selfish, and the math takes care of the rest. Kyle, positioned as the episode's moral engine, decides to produce a homemade version of semaglutide to help people who cannot afford the pharmaceutical version. It is a plot line that touches on drug accessibility, the ethics of pharmaceutical pricing, the gray market for prescription medications, and the desperation of people caught between a system that creates obesity through the food industry and a system that profits from treating it through the pharmaceutical industry. The two industries, the special observes, are not in opposition. They are in partnership. One creates the problem, the other sells the solution. And between them, people like Cartman, people without money, people without the right diagnosis code, people without the right insurance plan, are caught in a machine that was never designed to help them. The special does not let anyone off the hook. It mocks the pharmaceutical industry for pricing life-saving medication beyond the reach of the people who need it most. It mocks the food industry for spending billions of dollars engineering products specifically designed to be addictive, products calibrated to overwhelm the brain's reward centers and create patterns of consumption that lead directly to the obesity. The pharmaceutical industry then charges thousands of dollars to treat. It mocks the body positivity movement for functioning, in practice, as a coping mechanism for economic inequality, rather than a genuine solution. It mocks celebrities who use semaglutide to sculpt perfect bodies while publicly advocating for self-acceptance. And it mocks the healthcare system for creating a two-tiered structure in which the quality of treatment is determined entirely by ability to pay. Lizzo herself responded to the special publicly. She took to social media and said that she really showed the world how to love yourself. It was a gracious response, and it was also, perhaps unintentionally, a confirmation of the special's thesis. Lizzo is not the villain of the end of obesity. She is not even a target. She is a symptom. She is what the system offers to people who cannot afford the cure. Reviews were mixed, but generally positive. Critics praised the special's willingness to engage with a genuinely complex social issue rather than simply mocking easy targets. Some reviewers noted that the special felt uneven, with brilliant individual moments separated by stretches that did not quite cohere. But the core argument, that the intersection of obesity, poverty, and pharmaceutical capitalism had created a system so absurd that only South Park could properly articulate its logic, landed with undeniable force. The end of obesity is not the funniest thing South Park has ever produced. It is not the most controversial, but it might be the most structurally ambitious in its critique. It takes on an entire ecosystem of industries, movements, and cultural attitudes, and it finds the thread that connects them all. The thread is money. It is always money. The food industry makes money by making people fat. The pharmaceutical industry makes money by making people thin. The insurance industry makes money by denying people access to the drugs that would make them thin. And the body positivity movement, for all its good intentions, functions as a pressure valve, telling people that none of this matters, that they should love themselves regardless, which is true and also completely beside the point when the question is whether a child can afford the medication that will keep him alive. The special's genius is in making that observation feel not cynical, but clarifying. This is how it works. This is who benefits. This is who suffers. And if that makes you uncomfortable, well, that is kind of the point. It has always been the point. For 27 years and counting, that has been the only point South Park has ever tried to make. Look at this. Look at how absurd this is. And then ask yourself why you are okay with it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.